All right, everybody, today we have a corporate revenge story that plays out not over weeks or months, but over 23 years. A guy joins a mid-sized manufacturing company right out of college and quietly buys discounted employee stock every single paycheck for over 2 decades. Nobody notices. Nobody cares. He's just the steady, reliable operations guy who keeps the factory floor running. Then the company founder retires, and his arrogant son takes the wheel. The son starts gutting the old guard, demoting veterans, replacing them with his business school buddies. Our guy gets demoted from VP of operations to senior associate. That's when he walks into the next board meeting. Because his accumulated shares, they make him the third largest individual shareholder in the entire company, and he uses every single one of those votes. This is a masterclass in patience. Let's get into it. I quietly bought employee stock. Every paycheck for 23 years. When the founder's son took over and demoted me, I showed up to the board meeting as the third largest shareholder and voted to remove him. I've been sitting on this story for about 4 months now, and I think enough has settled that I can finally tell it without getting emotional. Though honestly, even writing this out, I can feel the adrenaline creeping back in. Some things stay with you. My name's Garrett. I'm 45 years old. And until recently, I was the vice president of operations at a mid-sized manufacturing company in the Midwest. I'm not going to name the company, legal reasons obviously, but I'll tell you that we make industrial components. Valves, fittings, coupling assemblies, that kind of thing. Not glamorous. Not the kind of company that ends up in business magazines, but the kind of company that keeps other companies running. If your water treatment plant works, if your HVAC system doesn't leak, if the hydraulic press at your local factory operates without blowing a seal, there's a decent chance our parts are in there somewhere. I joined this company when I was 22. Fresh out of college with a degree in industrial engineering from a state school most people have never heard of, and a mountain of student loan debt. I got hired as a production floor coordinator, which is a fancy title for the guy who makes sure the machines are running and nobody loses a finger. Starting salary was $38,000. In 2003. Not terrible for the area, but it wasn't buying me a boat. The company was founded by a man I'll call Ray Whitmore. Ray was old school. And I mean genuinely old school. He'd started the company in 1974 in a rented warehouse with 3 employees and a single CNC lathe that broke down every other Tuesday. By the time I joined, the company had grown to about 400 employees, 2 manufacturing facilities, and annual revenue in the neighborhood of $80 million. Ray was still running the show, still walking the factory floor every morning at 6 a.m., with a coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He knew every machine operator by name. He knew their kids' names. He'd been to their weddings and their funerals and everything in between. Ray saw something in me early on. I don't say that to brag. I think what he saw was that I actually liked the work. I liked being on the floor. I liked understanding how a raw steel rod becomes a precision valve body through 12 separate machining operations. I liked solving problems. When a production bottleneck appeared, I didn't just flag it for someone else. I dug into it, figured out the root cause, and came back with a fix. Ray noticed that. Within 3 years, I was promoted to production supervisor. 2 years after that, plant manager of our secondary facility. And by the time I was 32, 10 years in, Ray made me VP of operations. I was responsible for both plants, all production scheduling, quality assurance, supply chain coordination, and about 240 direct and indirect reports. I loved that job. Not every day. Some days were brutal, and there were stretches where I worked 60-hour weeks and came home so tired I'd fall asleep on the couch with my shoes on. But I loved walking through a plant that was running well. There's a rhythm to a good manufacturing operation, almost like music. Machines humming, forklifts moving in predictable patterns, the quality check station flowing without backup. When it all clicks, it's beautiful. My wife Laura thinks I'm insane for saying that. She's probably right. Now here's the part that matters. The part that set everything in motion 23 years before it paid off. When I started at the company in 2003, Ray had an employee stock purchase program. It was simple. Every employee could elect to have up to 10% of their gross pay deducted and used to purchase company stock at a 15% discount from the current assessed value. The company wasn't publicly traded. It was privately held. so the stock value was determined by an annual independent appraisal. The shares had limited liquidity. You couldn't just sell them on an exchange, but there was an internal buyback program that let employees cash out shares at fair market value once a year if they wanted to. Most employees either didn't participate or participated at a low level, 1 or 2%. The discount was nice, but the stock was illiquid, and people needed their paychecks for, living. Mortgage payments, car notes, groceries, kid stuff. I signed up at the maximum, 10%, for my very first paycheck. Okay, hold on. What Garrett just casually mentioned is actually insane. 10% of his gross pay, starting at 22, on a salary of $38,000. That's $3,800 a year going into company stock he can't easily sell. At 22. When most of us were spending our paychecks on ramen and bad furniture from Craigslist. This isn't some Wall Street power move. This is a 22-year-old kid eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day so he could buy stock in a valve company. And he did it for 23 years. Every single paycheck. Keep that in your head as this story unfolds. I know what you're thinking. Why? Why would a 22-year-old making 38 grand a year put 10% into illiquid stock in a manufacturing company? And the honest answer is kind of embarrassing. My dad told me to. My dad was a machinist his whole life, worked at a tool and die shop for 31 years. Never made more than $55,000 in a single year. But he retired comfortably because his company had a similar stock purchase program, and he'd been putting money in since he was 25. When he retired, his shares were worth just over $400,000. Not life-changing rich, but enough to supplement his pension and live without worry. He sat me down the week before I started my job and said, "Garrett, if they offer you stock at a discount, you buy it. Every paycheck. You don't think about it. You don't touch it. You don't sell it when things get tight. You buy it like it's oxygen and you put it in a drawer and you forget it exists. 20 years from now, you'll thank me." So I did. And for 23 years, I basically forgot it existed. Well, not entirely. I got statements every year showing my accumulated shares and their appraised value. I watched the numbers grow. Slowly at first. When I was making 38 grand, 10% was only about $320 a month. But as I got promoted and my salary grew, I was making $162,000 by the time I became VP. That 10% became a much larger number. And the stock itself appreciated. The company grew. Revenue went from $80 million when I started to about $220 million by last year. The share price, as determined by the annual appraisal, had roughly quadrupled over my tenure. I never sold a single share. Not one. Not when Laura and I bought our house. Not when we had our son. Not when we had our daughter. Not when the transmission on my truck blew and the repair was $2,200. Not when the recession hit in 2008 and Laura lost her job for 6 months. Every time I thought about cashing out some shares, I heard my dad's voice in my head. "You don't touch it. You buy it like oxygen." So I bought, and bought, and bought for 23 years. Now let me tell you about Junior. Ray Whitmore had one son. I'll call him Nolan, but everyone at the company called him Junior behind his back, and honestly, some people said it to his face. Junior was about 5 years younger than me. He'd grown up watching his dad build this company, but he hadn't really participated in it. He went to a private university, got an MBA, and spent a few years at a consulting firm where he mostly made PowerPoint presentations and told other companies how to run more efficiently without ever having run anything himself. Junior had been around the company off and on for years. He'd show up at the annual holiday party in a suit that cost more than most of our floor workers made in a week. He'd shake hands and make small talk that always circled back to his MBA or his consulting experience. He once told me at a company barbecue that our production scheduling system was antiquated and that we should implement a real-time demand-responsive allocation model. I asked him what that meant in practical terms. He stared at me for about 3 seconds and said, "It's about optimizing throughput." That's not an answer. That's a sentence from a textbook. But I smiled and nodded because he was the founder's son. Ray started slowing down around 2023. He was 72, and you could see it. He'd been this tireless force for decades, but the years were catching up. He stopped doing the morning floor walks. He delegated more. He started talking about retirement, and everyone knew what was coming. Junior was going to take over. It happened in early 2025. Ray officially retired as CEO and chairman of the board. He stayed on as a board member. he still owned about 31%, the single largest individual stake, but stepped back from day-to-day operations. Junior was named CEO. The first month was quiet. Junior spent it assessing the organization, walking around, having long meetings with outside consultants, sending company-wide emails about entering a new chapter of growth and innovation. Standard stuff. Nobody loved it, but nobody panicked. We figured he'd settle in and let us do our jobs. We were wrong. Quick timeout. I want everybody to notice something about this story so far. Garrett has been at this company for 23 years. He started on the production floor. He worked his way up to VP of operations. He knows every machine, every process, every bottleneck, every vendor relationship, every single thing that makes this company function. Junior has an MBA and some consulting slides. And Junior just became CEO. That right there, that gap between institutional knowledge and inherited authority, is a ticking bomb. Garrett doesn't know it yet, but the fuse is already lit. Back to him. Month 2 is when Junior started making moves. Real moves. He brought in 3 guys from his MBA program. I'll call them the trio, because that's what the floor workers called them. One was named Blake, one was Preston, and one was Keith. Blake was installed as Chief Strategy Officer, which is a title that sounds important but means nothing if you don't have a strategy. Preston became Director of Operational Excellence, a title that made me physically cringe since I'd been doing operational excellence without the title for 20 years. And Keith was made Head of Workforce Optimization, which is corporate speak for the guy who decides who gets fired. The trio were Junior's guys. They'd gone to school with him, they'd worked at the same consulting firm, and they spoke the same language. A language made entirely of buzzwords and frameworks and acronyms that nobody on the factory floor had ever heard of or needed to hear. They were in their mid-30s, wore slim-fit suits to a manufacturing company, and walked through the plant like tourists visiting a zoo. I once saw Preston stop in front of a CNC lathe and take a picture of it with his phone, like it was a landmark. I've never wanted to scream more in my life. But the real damage wasn't the trio themselves. It was what their hiring meant for everyone else. Junior needed room. Budget room, title room, org chart room. And to make room for his guys, he started pushing out the old guard. Not firing. He was too smart for that, or his lawyers were. Demoting, restructuring, realigning roles to better fit the company's evolving operational model. Helen Park, our Director of Quality Assurance, a woman who had been with the company for 19 years and who could spot a defective part from across the room, was restructured into a senior quality analyst role. Same work, less pay, less authority, no direct reports. She was furious, but she was also 57 and knew that finding an equivalent position at her age would be rough. Dan Briggs, our head of supply chain, 17 years with the company, was moved to supply chain coordinator. His responsibilities were handed to Blake, who had never managed a supply chain in his life, and who, within 3 weeks, double-ordered 6 months' worth of raw aluminum because he didn't understand our purchasing cycles. That surplus cost the company about $90,000 in carrying costs and wasted warehouse space. And then there was me. Junior called me into his office on a Wednesday, the office that used to be Ray's. He'd redecorated, gone were Ray's photos of the original warehouse, the old blueprint of the first product line, the framed newspaper clipping from when the company hit its first $1 million in revenue. In their place, abstract art, a glass desk, and one of those ridiculous standing desk converters that he never actually used in the standing position. It looked like a Silicon Valley office had sneezed on a manufacturing company. He said, "Garrett, I've been reviewing the organizational structure, and I think we need to make some changes to position the company for the future." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm restructuring the operations division. Preston is going to be overseeing operations going forward as Director of Operational Excellence. I think your experience and institutional knowledge would be best applied in a more focused, hands-on capacity." I waited. He said, "I'm moving you to a senior associate role. You'll still be involved in operations, but you'll be reporting to Preston." Senior associate. I'd been VP of operations for 13 years. I'd helped grow the company from 80 million to 220 million in revenue. I'd managed 2 plants, 240 people, and the entire production apparatus of the company. And Junior was demoting me to senior associate, a title we normally give to people 3 years out of college, and asking me to report to a guy who'd taken a photo of a CNC lathe like it was the Eiffel Tower. I sat there for a moment. I could feel the anger, hot, immediate, the kind that makes your jaw tight and your hands heavy. But I didn't say anything stupid. I'd been in manufacturing long enough to know that the moment you lose your composure is the moment you lose your position. And I'd been watching Junior long enough to know this was coming. He was clearing the board. So I said, "I understand. When does this take effect?" He looked surprised. I think he expected me to argue, maybe even quit. A lot of guys in my position would have. Helen had cried. Dan had shouted. But I just sat there, calm, quiet. He said, "Effective next Monday." I said, "Okay. I have one question." He said, "Sure." I said, "When's the next board meeting?" He frowned. Like the question didn't compute. He said, "The quarterly board meeting is in 3 weeks. Why?" I said, "Just curious. I want to make sure I understand the company's direction." He nodded, clearly confused but not concerned. Why would he be? I was just the old guard, the relic, the guy who'd been building this company since before Junior finished high school. What threat could I possibly pose? He had no idea. This is where 23 years of stock buying becomes the most important detail in the entire story. Garrett never talked about his shares at work, never brought it up. His statements went to his home address. The stock program was administered through an outside firm, so even the company's finance team didn't have a clear picture of individual holdings. Junior inherited a company. He knew the org chart, the revenue, the board composition, or thought he did. What he did not know was that a quiet operations VP had been accumulating shares for 2 decades. Junior was playing checkers on a board he didn't even own. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with Laura. I told her about the demotion. She was angry, angrier than me actually, which is saying something because Laura is generally the calm one in our marriage. She said, "After everything you've given that company, 23 years and he demotes you to senior associate?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Something I've been thinking about for a while." I went to the filing cabinet in our home office. I pulled out 23 years of annual stock statements, every single one, and I laid them out on the kitchen table. It took up the whole table. Laura had to move the salt and pepper shakers. Here's what 23 years of consistent stock purchasing looks like when you do the math. At 10% of my salary, starting at $38,000 and gradually increasing to $162,000, with a 15% discount on every purchase, and with the stock price roughly quadrupling over the period due to company growth, my accumulated position was significant, very significant. I'll give you the number because I think it matters. My shares represented approximately 8.6% of the total outstanding stock. 8.6%. In a company where Ray still held about 31%, and a handful of early investors and board members held chunks ranging from 2 to 12%. The second largest individual shareholder was a board member named Phyllis Keegan, who held about 11%. The third largest was an original investor named Don Crawford, with about 9%. And the fourth largest? That was me, at 8.6%. Except, and this is the part that mattered, Don had recently sold about a quarter of his shares through the internal buyback program to fund his retirement. His position had dropped to roughly 6.5% by the time of the quarterly meeting, which made me, Garrett, the freshly demoted senior associate, the third largest individual shareholder in the company. I called the company's stock administrator the next morning. I asked to confirm my total share count and my voting rights. Everything was in order. Every share I'd purchased over 23 years carried full voting rights. I also confirmed something I'd suspected, but wanted to be sure about. The company's bylaws allowed any shareholder with more than 5% ownership to request a formal agenda item at a board meeting, provided they submitted it in writing at least 10 business days before the meeting. I submitted my agenda item the next day. It read, "Motion to evaluate current executive leadership and consider a change in CEO appointment." I submitted it through the stock administrator, who forwarded it to the board secretary. The board secretary was required by the bylaws to include it on the agenda. No discretion, no approval needed from the CEO. It was an automatic right of any qualifying shareholder. And then I waited. The 3 weeks between my demotion and the board meeting were strange. I showed up to work every day in my new senior associate role. I reported to Preston, who had no idea how to run operations and who spent most of his time in meetings with Junior and Blake discussing synergy frameworks. Meanwhile, production was slipping. On-time delivery rates dropped from 94% to 81% in just 2 weeks. 2 long-term customers, companies we'd supplied for over a decade, called to express concerns about quality and delivery reliability. One of them said, and I'm paraphrasing, "What on earth is going on over there?" I documented everything. Every missed shipment, every quality issue, every customer complaint, every decision Preston made that I would have handled differently. Not out of spite, out of preparation. Because I knew that when the board meeting came, I'd need more than just shares. I'd need evidence, data, a clear, undeniable picture of what Junior's leadership was doing to the company Ray had spent 50 years building. Helen and Dan both came to me separately during those 3 weeks. They knew something was happening. They'd heard through the grapevine that a shareholder had submitted an agenda item about executive leadership. They didn't know it was me. Nobody did. I kept it quiet. I didn't want Junior to have time to prepare, to politic, to work the board members in advance. I wanted the full weight of the moment to land without warning. The night before the board meeting, I pressed my best suit. Laura watched me from the doorway of our bedroom and said, "You look like you're going to a trial." I said, "I kind of am." She said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "No." And I meant it. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I'd been ready for 23 years. I just didn't know it until now. Right! So let me paint this picture because I don't want anyone to miss what's about to happen. A quarterly board meeting. Around the table, board members, Ray Whitmore, the retired founder, Junior, the new CEO, the trio, Junior's MBA buddies who have been running the place into the ground for 2 months. And then the door opens, and in walks Garrett, the guy Junior demoted to senior associate 3 weeks ago. Except he isn't there as an employee. He's there as the 3rd largest individual shareholder. He's got a suit, a stack of documents, and 23 years of quiet patience that is about to become very, very loud. The board meeting was held in the main conference room at our headquarters. Long table, leather chairs, a projector setup that nobody ever got to work on the first try. Standard stuff. I'd been in that room hundreds of times for operational reviews, but I'd never been in it for a board meeting. Employees didn't attend board meetings. Shareholders did. I arrived 10 minutes early. The board secretary, a woman named Gail, who'd been handling board administration for 15 years, saw me walk in and did a double take. She said, "Garrett, can I help you?" I said, "I'm here for the board meeting. I'm the shareholder who submitted the agenda item." She looked at her paperwork. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at her paperwork again. She said, You have 8.6%? I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said very quietly, "Well, that's something." I took a seat. Not at the main table. I didn't want to be presumptuous. I sat in one of the chairs along the wall, reserved for observers and presenters. I had a folder with me. Inside, my stock statements, the company's operational performance data from the past 2 months, the customer complaints, the financial impact of Blake's aluminum overordering disaster, and the bylaw provision authorizing my agenda item and my voting rights. The board members filtered in. Phyllis Keegan was there. Don Crawford was on speakerphone. 2 independent board members. Ray walked in slowly. He leaned on a cane now, but his eyes were sharp. He saw me and raised an eyebrow. Not hostile, curious. Ray had always been observant. Junior walked in last, flanked by Blake and Preston. He was carrying a tablet and wearing the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. He saw me, and his expression flickered. Confusion, annoyance, dismissal, all in about half a second. He said, "Garrett, I think you may be in the wrong meeting." I said, "I'm not." He laughed, like I'd told a mildly amusing joke, and sat down at the head of the table. Gail called the meeting to order. They ran through the standard agenda items, financial review, quarterly earnings, operational updates, which Junior had Preston present, and which were, to be blunt, a disaster disguised in optimistic language. Then Gail said, "We have one additional agenda item, submitted by a qualifying shareholder. The item is a motion to evaluate current executive leadership and consider a change in CEO appointment. The submitting shareholder is Garrett Co." Every head in the room turned to me. Junior's face went from confusion to something I can only describe as the expression of a man who just realized the ground beneath him isn't as solid as he thought. I stood up, I walked to the table, and I spoke. I didn't shout. I didn't get emotional. I presented data. 2 months of operational performance under Junior's leadership. On-time delivery down 13 percentage points. 2 major customer relationships at risk. A $90,000 surplus aluminum mistake. 3 senior leaders with a combined 59 years of experience demoted and replaced by consultants with 0 manufacturing background. Employee morale scores, which I'd gathered informally but accurately, at their lowest point in the company's recent history. I laid it out piece by piece, calmly, factually, like I was presenting a production efficiency report, which in a way I was. I'd been reading production reports for 23 years. I knew how to present data that told a story, and this data told a very clear story. Junior was dismantling the operational foundation of a company his father spent 50 years building. When I finished, Junior tried to respond. He said something about growing pains and necessary restructuring and long-term strategic vision. But the numbers were on the table, and numbers don't care about your MBA. Then I said the words that mattered. As the holder of 8.6% of outstanding company shares, I move for a formal vote of no confidence in the current CEO and a motion to remove him from the position. Junior went pale, actually pale, like the blood left his face in real time. He looked at his father. Ray was looking at me, not angry, not surprised, almost, and I know this sounds strange, almost proud, like he was watching someone do exactly what he would have done in the same situation. Ray had spent 50 years building a company by being tough and smart and strategic. I think in that moment he recognized the same qualities in someone else. The vote happened. Phyllis voted yes. Don, on speakerphone, voted yes. One of the independent board members voted yes. Ray, and this was the moment that mattered most. Ray voted yes. His own son. He voted to remove his own son as CEO. I could see the pain in his face, but I could also see the clarity. He loved his son, but he loved his company too. And his company was being destroyed. Junior voted no. Blake and Preston weren't board members, so they didn't vote. The other independent board member abstained. The motion passed, 4-1, with 1 abstention. Junior was removed as CEO effective immediately. He sat there for about 30 seconds after the vote, not saying anything. Then he stood up, took his tablet, and walked out. Blake and Preston followed him like ducklings, who just lost their mother duck. An interim CEO was appointed that afternoon, Phyllis Keegan, who had extensive manufacturing industry experience and who, frankly, should have been considered for the role before Junior. Within a week, Phyllis reversed the demotions. Helen was restored to Director of Quality Assurance. Dan was restored to Head of Supply Chain. And I was restored to VP of Operations. The trio, Blake, Preston, and Keith, were let go within 2 weeks. Keith, the workforce optimization guy, didn't even have time to optimize his own severance package. Aftermath. It's been about 4 months now. The company is recovering. On-time delivery is back up to 92% and climbing. The 2 customer relationships that were at risk have been stabilized. It took some personal visits and a lot of honest conversation, but we kept them. The surplus aluminum is being worked through slowly. Morale is better, not perfect. The whole episode left scars, but better. Ray is still on the board. He and I had a conversation a few days after the meeting. Just the 2 of us, in his old office, which Phyllis hadn't redecorated. Smart woman. He said, "Garrett, how long have you been buying stock?" I said, "Since my first paycheck." He laughed. Not a big laugh. He's not that kind of guy, but a real one. He said, "Your father was a machinist, wasn't he?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "He taught you well." That was it. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Junior hasn't been back to the company. I heard through the grapevine that he's consulting again, which feels right. Some people are better at telling others how to run things than actually running things themselves. I still buy stock every paycheck. 10%. Same as always. Laura asked me if I was ever going to stop. I said, "My dad told me to buy it like oxygen. You don't stop breathing." My son is 19 now. He's in college. Last month he asked me for advice about his first job, a part-time thing at a local hardware store. I told him the same thing my dad told me. If they offer you stock at a discount, buy it. Every paycheck. Don't think about it. Don't touch it. 20 years from now, you'll thank me. He said, Dad, it's a hardware store. They don't offer stock. I said, okay, then save 10% of every check. Same principle. He rolled his eyes. He'll learn. One more thing. About a week after the board meeting, Helen, the quality director who'd been demoted and then restored, stopped by my office. She closed the door and said, Garrett, how much stock do you actually own? I told her. She stared at me for a solid 5 seconds. Then she said, you've been sitting on that for 23 years and you never told anyone? I said, nobody ever asked. She shook her head and said, you are the most patient person I've ever met in my life, and also slightly terrifying. I said, thank you. She said, it wasn't entirely a compliment. I said, I know, I'll take it anyway. Dan came by later that same day. He'd heard from Helen. Of course he had. Those two are the company gossip pipeline, always have been. He said, is it true you're the third largest shareholder? I said, it is. He said, and you've just been sitting here at your desk for 23 years, buying stock? I said, I was also doing my job, Dan. He laughed so hard he had to sit down. My dad passed away in 2019. He never got to see this chapter. But I think he'd have appreciated it. Not the drama, he wasn't a drama guy, but the principle. That consistency beats flash. That showing up and doing the quiet, boring, steady thing for 20 years can position you in ways that no amount of short-term cleverness can match. Junior had the name, the title, the MBA, and the corner office. I had a payroll deduction and patience. And in the end, patience won. Laura framed one of my stock statements, the most recent one, the one that shows the full 23-year accumulation. It's hanging in our home office next to my dad's retirement photo. 2 blue-collar families, 2 generations, same lesson. Buy the stock, do the work, and wait. Sometimes the wait is what matters most. Final update. There was one moment I haven't mentioned because I've been saving it. During the board meeting, after the vote, when Junior was walking out and the room was dead silent, Ray looked at me from across the table. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. One slow nod. And then he looked away. I've thought about that nod every day since. I think it meant thank you. I think it meant I'm sorry it came to this. And I think, somewhere in there, it meant something else. A recognition that the company he'd built from nothing in a rented warehouse was going to survive. Not because of bloodline or business school, but because some kid he hired in 2003 loved the work enough to stay for 23 years and care enough to fight for it when it mattered. I'll probably stay at this company until I retire. I'll keep buying stock every paycheck. And when the time comes, I'll cash it all out, just like my dad did, and Laura and I will live without worry. That's the plan. Not flashy, not complicated, but it works. If you've read this far, here's my question. Have you ever had a long game moment? Something you did consistently for years that finally paid off in a big way? Or are you still in the middle of your long game? I'd love to hear about it. I think more people are playing the long game than they realize. They just haven't gotten to the part where it matters yet. 23 years. 276 paychecks. 10% every single time. No exceptions, no withdrawals, no shortcuts. And when the moment came, when the guy with the corner office and the MBA tried to push him out, Garrett didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't quit. He showed up to a board meeting with a folder and a voting stake that nobody saw coming. The founder voted to remove his own son. The old guard was restored. And the quiet guy who'd been buying stock like it was oxygen turned out to be the most powerful person in the room who wasn't named Whitmore. This might be the single greatest example of play stupid games, win stupid prizes I've ever covered. Except Garrett wasn't playing a stupid game. He was playing the longest game. And he won. Drop a comment and tell me about your long game. What are you building quietly right now that nobody sees coming? Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.